interoperable is avoiding timeouts and allowing for pauses. And so I know this can be a difficult one because we all love GIFs, we all love video content. We're so used to everything auto playing all the time, and it can be useful if, you know, we want a hands-free experience. But when you're designing for people who have cognitive disabilities, it can be distracting. And if video is auto playing, it can also be intrusive to people who are using screen readers. And it's just creating a disruptive, overwhelming experience. Also, content that times out is just generally a bad experience for everyone because maybe you weren't paying attention and it just timed out. You don't know where it went. You don't even know what you were looking at. So you want to ensure that if you have pop-ups or whatever, they persist long enough so that a user can explicitly press the close button. Or just allow the user to adjust the time frame if you have that setting available, or just completely turn off the timeout. And then also it's best to just avoid flashing content as it can be distracting to people. And obviously it can cause seizures for some, especially those who have cognitive disabilities. All right, last section, understandable. And of course, obviously understandability is extremely crucial for everyone, but especially people who have disabilities and executive functioning challenges. So let's look at some guidelines to increase comprehension. So many of these are focused on cognitive disabilities, and you can find these in COGA, the Cognitive Accessibility Guidelines. So someone who experiences language processing or memory challenges will need plain language, and it helps them understand the ideas that you're trying to convey and the important content. And so WCAG recommends using a secondary or second grade level to ensure everyone can comprehend your written content. And it's best to use a passive voice rather than an active voice, sorry, rather than a passive voice, and be concise, of course, rather than, you know, having long run-on sentences or dense paragraphs. Obviously, you know, it's best to avoid abbreviations where possible so that people understand without a doubt what you're trying to say, or at least the very first time, tell them what the full word stands for, or the abbreviation stands for. And then it's also worth noting that implied language such as jokes or metaphors or idioms can be difficult for people with cognitive disabilities. So overall, it's best to avoid them, but I also understand it may be part of your personal branding. So try to test it out with a few people to see if it resonates. But if you don't use metaphors and idioms, it also helps with localization. So translating these words into different languages. All right, so use dyslexic friendly fonts. So there's a study run by Yahoo Labs, which proved that sans serif fonts that are monospace and Roman font types increase the reading performance, while italic fonts and underlined fonts decrease reading performance. So you want to use serif fonts such as Arial, Comic Sans. I know there's like the whole thing with Comic Sans was actually helpful for people with dyslexia. But there's also alternatives to Verdana, Tahoma, Sentry, Gothic, Calibri, Open Sans, and so on. However, as I mentioned, serif fonts like Times New Roman can be difficult for people with dyslexia. And that's because they have unique tails and shapes that complicate the basic letter and may, you know, cause someone to see a letter that isn't actually there. So as I mentioned, avoid underlining and italicizing words where possible, and instead use bold fonts or bolder fonts for emphasis. Next, ensure ample line spacing. So people with cognitive disabilities need a page layout that allows them to follow along and understand the content without getting overwhelmed. But I also think this honestly applies to everyone. I get super overwhelmed when just seeing a huge essay. Like, I definitely don't want to read that. So support users by adding ample line spacing, but also left aligning text is really useful. And avoiding justified text or multiple columns of text where possible. Obviously, a resume, you know, you only have a certain amount of space, but if you can ensure that there's proper grouping of content, that'll support people with cognitive disabilities. Also, lines shouldn't be longer than like 60 to 70 characters. And overall, like the goal is to reduce clutter and use like good section headings and spacing to inform related content. And then lastly, avoid relying on memory alone. So users with short-term and memory difficulties need systems that don't require them to remember everything, especially when it comes to information entered at the previous step in a process. And so poor designs oftentimes rely on memory. So such as like a voice menu system, when it's like, press 1 for this, press 2 for this, press 3 for this, and it goes on forever and you forget what you were even there for. So examples of not relying on memory alone are a site where you don't have to remember your password, such as, you know, the saved key passwords in Chrome. There's also just like less multi-step processes. And if you do have one, there are stepper components, and also not having to decipher a lot of words or unfamiliar icons. But it's also important to use supporting iconography whenever you are trying to communicate more complex information. All right, so I know we're running out of time, so I just want to breeze through some quick examples now that you kind of have an understanding of what good principles are. So good examples, I think they're not like the prettiest sites, but they're decent. So the first one being LinkedIn, and you may be able to see at the top, there's a skip to link, which we didn't get to go through today, but essentially skip to links allow for people to skip to the main content quickly. So you don't have to use a screen reader per se. Let's say you're sighted, but you can't really use a mouse because you have a mobility disability. So essentially a skip to link will allow me to press tab and then press enter, and all of a sudden I move to the main content body. There's also a visible focus indicator. As I mentioned, right now it's around the skip to search link. And that way users know exactly where they're at. Also, it's not displayed here, but if you navigate LinkedIn with your tab key and move your focus to just an avatar, one of your connections, it'll expand a hover card, and hover cards are oftentimes notorious in accessibility because you can't really ever move your focus into the hover card. And so usually in LinkedIn, if you just tab again, your focus moves to the hover card, which is a good experience. There's also gov.uk. It's a really random site, but it is a good site. And once again, they have a visible focus indicator. So at the top, what's in yellow is the topics dropdown. That is where your focus is at, and it's clear where you're at. And also the focus order follows from top down, left to right. So some poor accessibility sites, I hate to say it, but I think we all know it. Instagram is not the best at accessibility. They have an alt text feature, fortunately, but it's buried behind their advanced settings. So it's oftentimes hidden and it's just not promoted or expected. And also many videos on Instagram don't have captions. They've recently added automated captions, which is a start, but a lot of times captions aren't there or available. And also their stories don't work with assistive technology. And I hate to say it because I love YouTube as well. But YouTube is also a poor experience, or it could be better. So right now, the focus indicator, if you all can see, the music chip is in white. Right next to that, towards the right, is a live chip. That's what the title is called, live. That is the focus indicator. I can't tell the difference between live or mixes, but technically live is where my focus is at. So you can see the importance of having a visible focus indicator. Also on YouTube, you know, they unfortunately, like many apps, have endless scroll, which causes navigation strain. And instead they could use pagination to help users quickly navigate between pages, as opposed to just tab, tab, tab through every card possible. And then when you click on a video, you know, there are ads that start, which can be distracting or confusing to users and just frustrating for all of us. And then they use single character key shortcuts, which we didn't get into, but it's another WCAG requirement. And essentially, when you have a keyboard shortcut, you don't want to only use one letter. And that is because if you're just randomly typing or accidentally press a letter on your keyboard, all of a sudden an action flares off. So in this instance, when you click into a video and accidentally press the M key on your keyboard, it'll mute the video. And that has definitely happened to me multiple times. Now imagine someone who doesn't even realize that that's what they did. Now their video is muted. All right, so that was a ton of information, but I wanted to leave you with a summary of what we talked about in terms of perceivable, ensuring that you're using multi-sensory characteristics, you're using adequate contrast, you are really thinking carefully about your information hierarchy. And then in terms of if your system's operable, you're using descriptive headings, descriptive labels and text, and you avoid timeouts where possible and allow for pauses of auto-played content or constantly moving content. And then finally, your content is understandable. It's written at an easy to understand reading level. You're using fonts that are dyslexic friendly. There's ample line spacing within your text, and you're not relying on memory alone. So here are some resources. Feel free to take a screenshot of this, and I can also send Ritesh these links to send out to all of you. Wait one moment if you all want to take a screenshot. There's definitely more, but I think once you start with these, you'll go down the rabbit hole naturally. I think in terms of getting just started, I think the material accessibility site is really great if you haven't looked at it yet. And I've included some of those examples in my deck, so hopefully you'll recall some of this. Disabled World is great for really just learning about the worlds of disability and all the terms and all that. Deak University oftentimes breaks down some of the dense WCAG concepts, but they also have their own accessibility courses. There's also, where's the YouTube? It's on here somewhere. There we go. Ally Cast or A11Y Cast by Rob Dotson. If you're looking for something more technical, he goes in depth about focus order, DOM, all the stuff that I mentioned, but way more. And I recommend the book Mismatch by Kat Holmes. It's more anecdotal and it helps you just really empathize with people with disabilities. And then the other half are just tools that you could check out as you design. I really like the Funkify Chrome plugin. They have a free version that lasts like 7 days or something like that, but it essentially simulates different disability types and is a great empathy building tool. So you can change your color palettes into colorblind palettes to show you how they are perceived by someone who has color blindness. It also has like severe dyslexia where the letters are jumping around. There's like a ADD simulator, so like random stuff just happens. It's a crazy tool, so beware, but it is really great. And if you have an Android, I recommend the Accessibility Scanner app if you're working with an engineer to build out your app. That way you can test more of the technical side of accessibility, and if you have all your labels and things like that. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time. I hope you learned something.